the participants achieved at 6 months sort of the greatest weight loss that had been recorded in any trial that had not limited the amount of food they could be eating. So we hadn't limited their calories at all. We gave them specific direction around what kinds of foods they should be eating and how they should be eating, as far as, obviously keeping the diet with consisting of whole plant foods and also being low in fat. But we didn't mandate any exercise or anything like that. So when we look at trials that had been done on weight loss specifically, they would usually either limit calories or encourage a lot of exercise, and we didn't do either of those two things. And so we found that when we looked at studies that had done similar to us and hadn't restricted calories or anything like that, we got the best weight loss results that have been published. So that was pretty cool.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Creating a Vegan World. Today we have Dr. Luke Wilson. He's co-author of the Broad Study, which is a study about plant-based diets and their effects on the health. So a lot of people, they have questions about what's the right information, what do doctors recommend, and it all comes back to research studies. So I know there's the China study, there's the Broad Study, and other ones. So this is the source of information that a lot of medical experts give us. So I want to ask him about how medical studies work and all the information around that. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, no problems. I'm happy to be here.
Definitely. So before we get into the Broad Study and what you found about plant-based diets, maybe you want to give the background about, like what studies are, like what makes them credible, and all the things along those lines, where I'm sure I have a million questions about it.
Sure. So I guess basically where we start with, as far as studies are concerned, is that medicine is, at least nowadays, it obviously has a history of not being so evidence-based, but at least for the last 50, 60 years or so, we like to think that evidence-based medicine is really what we practice. And so what that means is that we're supposed to be basing our recommendations and our treatments and therapies that we offer on the best available evidence. And so obviously, in order to facilitate that, we need to have research showing exactly how effective particular treatments or therapies are, who they're effective for, if there's any side effects of them, and that's really what research offers.
Absolutely. And is there certain criteria? I know like some studies, they have small groups of participants, like say 60 people, other ones have thousands of people. Like, is there a certain point where it has to reach before it is like considered good to go into the general medical community?
It's a really good question, actually, because the funny thing is that you would think that would be the case. And so, but it's actually, it's an oversimplification, right? And so what we'll often see with very large studies is that when you've got a very small result, you need a large study in order to show that result. And the funny thing is a lot of the therapies that we have in medicine, a lot of the treatments, so our pills, largely the pills, the procedures tend to be a little bit more cut and dried, no pun intended. But basically, we need to have a large group for a lot of these studies to show any benefit. So just because a study has a small sample size doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valid, but that is a common misconception. And so the reason that we see literally thousands of people in some of the drug company trials is not because those trials are more, are better necessarily. It's because they actually need that number of people in order to show that there's any difference in taking the medication or not, which leads to, I suppose, one of the big issues with medicine as we have practicing it at the moment is that for a particular therapy, even things that are supposed to be very, very effective, like the statins, for example, are seen as like a blockbuster drug in medicine. And the number needed to treat for a statin is approximately one person, is approximately one person out of every 32 that's already had a heart attack will get a benefit from it in about 5 years. So you can see that you do have quite a large number needed to treat, even with a drug that's expected to be very effective. When we think about medications, and this is one of the ways that we started getting into this mode of thinking anyway, is really where we started to use medications more in medicine was the antibiotics. And we know with an antibiotic, someone has a bacterial infection, the number needed to treat for that is essentially, arguably about 1, because if they don't have the antibiotic, oftentimes the infection will get away on them. If they do, then that sorts it out. It's not strictly correct to say the number needed to treat is 1. It's probably different from that because some people's immune systems will fight that off regardless. But certainly that's a very effective medication compared to a lot of the other drugs that we have. And what we have found over the years is things that we thought previously, aspirin's a perfect example, where we thought, after someone's over the age of 50 or so, everyone should basically just be getting an aspirin because it's really effective and things. But what we've found in time is there's actually side effects. And so the benefit of it is less than, the risk for most people. And so that kind of brings us back to, with a lot of the medications that we're giving, we need a huge number of people to be treated, especially for some of the more recent ones, where they are a bit more controversial. You literally do need to have thousands of people enrolled in a study in order to show that that's any better than a placebo, which is not an optimal situation for us to be in. And that's the difference between doing something that's really useful for health, like a diet change, which is what we're looking at with, say, a whole food plant-based dietary pattern. And the number needed to treat for that is literally 1, you'll see everyone benefits from it. And so that's the unfortunate thing. So when you have a study of that, you don't need, thousands of people enrolled in order to show a difference, because you can still show that at the statistically significant level with a smaller group. And in fact, in some ways, it's more convincing to be able to show an effect with a sample size of 5, for example, than it is to be able to show a significant result with a sample size of 500.
That's great. And is there any difference between, I guess, the way studies are published with, I guess, medicine versus food? Like your studies on plant-based diet, is there different different processes, or is it pretty much the same?
It's pretty much the same process that you go through when you send it to a journal. But again, it's interesting because there is always skepticism around anything that's not, sort of in the medical paradigm. And like I said, our paradigm is very much focused on pills and procedures. And if you're doing anything that's outside of that, then you maybe do have to look at trying to put it in a different journal, or your process for getting that published is going to be perhaps a little bit trickier. That is starting to change because there has been a realization that, one of the reasons that certain things are getting published is simply because they have money behind them. So there's a lot of money in developing a new drug, because then your company has a patent on it for a certain number of years, and you can sell it for really high prices in the States, for example, before that patent comes off, and make a lot of money from it. Whereas, and a lot of the time with some of those trials, what they'll actually do is they'll do a bunch of trials and they'll only publish the ones that actually show that it's beneficial. And that's the kind of thing that started to, I suppose, get some of the journals to change their attitude towards what kind of studies they're publishing, because there has been a bit of exposure of that in the last sort of 5-10 years or so. And certain journals have changed their policies around what they will and won't publish and so forth, because they realized they were getting a little bit tricked or played by the pharmaceutical industry with that.
Yeah, when money's there, it just opens the door to corruption. And
unfortunately, yeah.
It's interesting. In my personal life, I'm an entrepreneur. I imported artichoke leaf extract from Peru to the United States the other year. Mm-hmm. And it was, I guess, a mythical hangover cure where I tried it. It worked for me. But then the FDA, they sent letters to all the competitors saying that this is a drug. If you cure hangovers, it has to be a drug. It's not studied. You can't do it. So it's kind of backed away. Then I found there was actually a small trial, I think 160 people, that showed it lowered LDL cholesterol by 22%. So I was like, wow, this is more aligned with my vegan values, and that kind of pushed me in the right direction. So it's interesting how government regulation pushes to things like that. So back into, I guess, what you're doing. So you did the broad study. So people who are not familiar with that, can you introduce, I guess, what you researched, what the findings were, and what your experience was like?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons that we actually ended up doing the broad study was, we were both at Gisborne Hospital, and which is a small rural hospital in the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand, a small town, Gisborne, which is about 30,000 people there. And when we were working at the hospital, we would be assigned to various teams that when we were working there. The general medical team would have a journal club, sort of once every couple of weeks or so. And the idea of the journal club is that we bring along an article and we get to talk about, what this article suggests that we should be doing as far as treatment goes for our patients and so forth. And so Nick and I both at different times had taken articles from the likes of Dean Ornish, for example, and his lifestyle heart trial, where he was, using a plant-based way of eating in order to help reverse cardiovascular disease, which we'd found really compelling. And so we took that along and presented it to our colleagues and to, obviously our senior doctors. And they were quite interested in it. But what they would say is that, oh, well, this is all very well, and this might work in, the United States, and it might work when people are getting given food, and provided with the meals that they need to eat. But this thing certainly wouldn't work in Gisborne, New Zealand. And so one of the reasons that we did this, because we'd both had experiences in the States working with the likes of Dr. John McDougall at his McDougall program, and also Dr. Michael Clapper at that stage at True North Health Centre. And we'd seen how effective this was for patients. So we already knew that it wasn't going to make a lick of difference whether you did this in New Zealand or, Australia or the Great Britain or the United States. It's the same. The treatment's going to work everywhere. But, this was like one of the reasons that we did the research. And this is talking about how generalizable are those results to a different population of people. And so I guess that was one of the critiques that our colleagues were giving there, as they said, well, works there, this is a different context, it didn't really make much sense to us, but that, it might not work here. And so that's one of the reasons that we ended up doing the research. And so what we wanted to do was take a group of patients and basically get them eating the same way as what we had seen work so well for the patients at True North and the McDougall program, and of course the research that we had from Caudwell Wesselston and Dean Ornish, get them eating that same way and just show that people, one, were interested in doing this and that they were able to do it, and two, the kinds of results that we had seen were just, sort of par for the course when you're eating like this. So that's what the broad study was, is our attempts to show that in a community setting in Gisborne.
Great. And what were the findings?
Right. So we found that the participants achieved at 6 months sort of the greatest weight loss that had been recorded in any trial that had not limited the amount of food they could be eating. So we hadn't limited their calories at all. We gave them specific direction around what kinds of foods they should be eating and how they should be eating, as far as, obviously keeping the diet consisting of whole plant foods and also being low in fat. But we didn't mandate any exercise or anything like that. So when we look at trials that had been done on weight loss specifically, they would usually either limit calories or encourage a lot of exercise. And we didn't do either of those two things. And so we found that when we looked at studies that had done similar to us and hadn't restricted calories or anything like that, we got the best weight loss results that have been published. So that was pretty cool.
It's amazing. And that's whole foods plant-based is what it's all about.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, I guess, in the more general sense in the medical community, or even nutritionists or I guess dietitians who want to recommend right diets to people, if they're interested in like starting a study, is there like a significant cost involved? Is there a big process? Or someone in that category who say they're passionate about, let's say, helping a specific condition, Is it? I don't have a question, but I'm sure you could fill in the blanks from there.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So it's well, I mean, we were just fresh out of medical school, basically. You know, we'd just done our first year and a half in the hospital. It's not like we were seasoned researchers or anything. So it certainly is possible. The main issues that you run into are around, there is a cost there. And so Nick and I both didn't take any money for doing this. And so we, in fact, kind of lost money because we weren't able to work at the hospital anymore for at least part of when we were doing the research, and we had to employ someone to help. But we did manage to find a trust, which we recognise in the research paper, who were interested in funding, and really what that ended up paying for mostly was simply the logistics of the program. So we had a we had a venue that we needed to use for it. We had obviously cooking sessions. A large part of the research itself was based around chef-led cooking sessions, and so we needed food for that, and we obviously needed the kitchen and the venue, and then surprisingly, like the main cost, it probably isn't surprising for people who know a lot about research, but for me it was surprising as the main cost was actually the blood tests and things that people were getting. So if you can find a way to get around that aspect of it, and you're not too worried about making too much money from it yourself, then you should be able to arrange it and do it. And the other thing I'd say too is it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that the neat thing about when you do this with a whole food plant-based way of eating is that you don't need huge amounts. You don't need a huge number of people to be doing this in order to show some really amazing results, and even to be able to show those to be statistically significant, because you are finding large changes. We showed, I think at 6 months, there were 12.1 kilograms of weight loss. And I think from memory, that was about 10.6 kilograms. So you can just about double that if you're wanting the pounds, not quite. 10.6 kilogram difference between what the control group was managing. So that's a huge difference on average. And so you're not going to miss that. Even if we'd only had probably 10 people, we would have still been able to show that difference was statistically significant, I'm sure.
That's
so
great.
Yeah. It's a really good modality to research. The problem is who's going to give you that funding for it, because you can't place a patent on healthy eating very easily. Not that you'd want to, of course, but yeah, it's just finding someone who will fund it. But certainly if people are doing like PhDs or master's research, it's a really awesome area for you to be doing, because then your university's funding, or you might have a scholarship or something like that that's going to fund a lot of it. So I'd really encourage people to consider that.
It's amazing. I know you asked like the question kind of like a frustration, like where does the funding come from? So there's universities, I guess there's philanthropy organizations, or are there other areas that have funded other studies before where that you've seen in this area?
Not really, to be honest. There's no sort of broccoli industry that's going to give you a whole lot of money, but there's definitely more and more organizations that people can get funding from nowadays, and also governmental organizations and so forth. So I think, and there may be philanthropists out there as well who are quite interested nowadays. We have more and more people, especially because of the environmental significance of this kind of dietary pattern. I think that people will find it a lot easier nowadays than perhaps we did. And also got to remember that we were kind of doing this a very small place. I think that the reality is if you can find a funder who's willing to fund this in a town of about 30,000 people, in a very rural and impoverished area of New Zealand, pretty much anywhere else in the world, you should be able to, just with a bit of luck and some hard work, I'm sure you'll be able to find someone who will help you out with it.
Great. In a different direction, I guess there's the research study and then there's the practical application of it. So how do you get from, I guess, the research to specific ways to improve people's lives, like in practice? How do you bridge that gap?
What we were doing essentially was, bridging that gap in some ways. Like it wasn't, we tried to make it very practical, and the program that we ran in theory is very something that people could do very easily. And there is a lot of money in healthcare, and it's just, as I was saying earlier, it's unfortunate because if we had a drug that we'd developed that did exactly the same things as what we had achieved with the dietary change, or what the participants had achieved with their dietary change, then we would be, multi-billionaires, and no, there wouldn't be a single probably healthcare funder in the country that hadn't heard about the study. Whereas because of what we did, how we achieved things, there's not that sort of impetus there. So you are sort of fighting against, I suppose, the bias of medicine towards the pills and procedures again, which I've said so many times already in this interview. But so it's not that it can't be done, but unfortunately, a lot of the time, the funding models and even what people expect. So I work in general practice in New Zealand, which is like a family doctor for anyone who's watching in the States. And people will come in and their expectation is not necessarily that you're going to say, hey, here's something that you could be doing. Their expectation is more like that drug model, which we've had basically since the start of the antibiotic era, which is, okay, you've got this problem, here's this pill, go and take this pill and it's going to fix it for you. And so some of it's not even necessarily something that we can blame on the medical profession or healthcare funders and so forth. It's more just a general idea of what medicine offers, which is, the quick fix and the easy option. And so, I mean, having said that, there are a large number of patients who are very interested in making lifestyle changes, but there's all sorts of things that can get in the way of that for them. It's not as easy as just saying, hey, go away and lose some weight, or go and eat, just plant-based or something like that. You actually need to provide them with some support. And that's why we built the program that we did. And so it's very applicable. And then, yeah, I think in some ways, the issue that you're asking about as far as translating it into practice is sort of more like, well, how do you translate this into practice? So, for example, when I'm working, I get 20 minutes with patients, or more likely, for most people working in general practice, they take 15 minutes. And I know in some parts of Australia, for example, there's this thing called 6-minute medicine, where people are trying to turn around patients in literally 6 minutes because they make more money that way. And also for some people will be thinking, well, I can serve more people this way as well. So how do you get real change, real diet changes and lifestyle changes? How do you support that with people that you might see for 15, 6 to 15 or 20 minutes? And that's a whole different ball game, I suppose. And then you've got, yeah. But the principles, I think, are still well established by the research, and you can kind of get an idea of what direction you should be heading in from what we've already published.
Definitely, yeah. You mentioned Dr. Clapper and Dr. Esselstyn. I interviewed both of them, and
oh, right, cool.
I guess getting information online. I haven't interviewed Dr. Greger yet, or hope I can, but I know he has nutritionfacts.org, where a lot of people, it takes that interest to get people to really make that change.
Yeah.
So you said, like, a lot of times, like, you could tell a patient to study, but they're not going to do anything, because human behavior and psychology is a huge aspect, where just kind of like grouping everything I'm learning with my documentary together. There's a social aspect. I went vegan because of the community. I went to potluck dinners every Saturday night. I made friends, and because that strong community, I stuck with vegan. Wasn't whole food plant-based at the time, is more junk food vegan, but it got me that far. And then I want to interview psychologists about like how to make those behavior changes. Because from my experience, it was probably about a year ago, I got my blood work done. I had high triglycerides, high cholesterol, and the doctor prescribed the medication for my triglycerides because they're a dangerous level. And because I'm having oil, potato chips, or French fries, things like that.
Yeah.
And in that moment, for the next 3.5 weeks, I was like 99% whole foods plant-based. And it took that fear and like some major event before I made that switch. So I think the way to get before there, is to make things interesting, get like a community around it, and show
Yeah.
some type of genuine interest. So it's interesting
Yeah.
how that works.
No,
But
I 100% agree. And I think that was one of the real strengths that we had with the broad study. And one of the reasons that we got the really good results is that, as I said earlier, perhaps you only need like 5 to 10 people to show the results. But in order to like start developing a community of people. And the other thing that we did as well, is that we actually went out to the community and we talked to restaurants and other food suppliers. And we said to them, hey, this is what we're doing. Would you guys be interested in having maybe just 1 or 2 items on your menu that would work for people who are doing this way of eating in this study? And we got, I think, 6 or 7 restaurants, a Thai restaurant, a Japanese sushi place, a couple of just standard restaurants. And we also had a baker who was working with us. And so he made sure that he had some bread that was all whole grain and wasn't using any oils and things. And so that just made it so much easier for these people because they were able to, they still had healthy options in their community. And I think that's been one of the biggest things that, on reflection, that I learned from the process is that it's easy to do something if you've got a real strong motivation at the time to do it, but after a while that motivation isn't necessarily there anymore. You can't expect there's a really good book called Tiny Habits by an author called BJ Fogg, and he talks about motivation being like a wave, and so it goes up and down, and you can't rely on motivation as being the thing that's going to maintain a lifestyle change or a habit. And so really what you need to do is change the environment. And if you think about it, in that environment that we had up there, it's probably one of the most obesogenic environments in New Zealand, and it's reflected in the high rates of chronic disease in the Gisborne area. And you don't have things like in the States, obviously you've got Whole Foods Market and things, and so you can go in there and you can get your salad buffet or whatever, and you can get even some of Rip Esselstyn's products and that kind of thing. So you've got all that stuff available to you. Gisborne has really good produce, but other than that, it's got a very high density, I would say, of takeaway outlets and unhealthy food. And so if you've got that all the time, there's only so much willpower you can exercise. So it needs to change at a systems level as well. And I think still our research showing that this is healthy, but more importantly, showing how much of a difference healthy eating can make, even for these participants. It's like, even if they go back, and a lot of them will have go back to somewhat how they were eating before, because it's just you're constantly your family or your whānau, people are offering you the KFC or the sweets or whatever it is. And so it's very hard to just keep resisting that all the time. And so over time, you're going to sort of trend back towards what the average is doing. So, but I think even if that was the case for them, all of them in the back of their mind have this one experience where they did this and they realized that if they ever needed to, they could go back to that and they would get similar results. And it kind of works as a demonstration of that to the medical community. Anyone who reads the study, it's like, because we pay lip service to healthy diet and healthy lifestyle, but nobody really realizes that, for example, in our study, 30% drop in medications, more or less, for the participants. So you don't have to take a medication for the rest of your life. That's what most people expect. That's what most doctors expect. And we had to train the doctors at the practice that we were working with how to take their patients off medications, because they had no idea how to do it. It's just not an experience that you normally have. So so I suppose the research also just shows how powerful diet can be, and that increases the likelihood that a policymaker or someone like that, hopefully in the future, would look at that and say, well, actually, it is worth us making some changes where we do make healthy foods more accessible and unhealthy ones less accessible. And these are the kinds of things that might be healthy foods because this is what worked for these people. So yeah, I'm always hopeful.
Definitely. And it's funny you mentioned, I guess, like when I ever go to my parents' house for Christmas time, I normally live in Boulder, Colorado. They live in North Carolina in a rural area. So it's like 20-minute drive to the nearest supermarket. And when I live in Boulder, I notice it's like kind of esoteric, like the vibe of the city is healthy. People are rock climbing, hiking, a lot of like organic, fresh, like produce market, thing like that. I go there, I lose weight, I do a lot of hiking, then I go back for Christmas. And then it's just there's potato chips on the counter. I finish the bag, a new one appears, and my weight goes up. So it's definitely real big about the community. And I think the book The Tipping Point, when a certain percentage of population goes away, then the rest follows. So it'd be interesting. Like I live on the internet for the most part, like everyone nowadays. But in your community, like if enough people go, I wonder if the rest will easily follow along, and just kind of like that peer pressure type of thing.
Yeah. And, no, definitely. It makes a big difference, the sort of social proof thing, and just the fact that those, for example, those restaurants were offering those options. It wouldn't just be our participants that were purchasing them. Some other people probably bought them, by accident, or just thought it was interesting. And so, you can make some changes for sure.
That's amazing what you're doing. So there's two questions. I know you have a busy day, so I just want to wrap things up. So you mentioned one thing as far as like getting off medication. So I think I asked this to Dr. Esselstyn in my interview, but I think it's more at the society level. But let's say my parents, let's say they have a genetic disposition for like high cholesterol or something like that. And I don't know, some doctors say there's no genetic aspect, it's 100% diet. And I think when I spoke with Dr. Clapper, he said like, if your metabolism does something a certain way, that's why your triglycerides might be high. Is it 100% diet, or is there some type of metabolism genetic aspect to cholesterol, triglycerides, diabetes, things like that?
It's a really good question. And I think, I think it's been asked so many times now, and we have to always say, look, it's never 100% something. It's always got components of things. And certainly there's people that, if we just look at cholesterol, it's a risk factor, right? And maybe even Dr. Clapper said this to you, but if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet and you have a cholesterol of whatever, I forget your guys' numbers, but for here, if it's 5, which is a little bit raised, for example, versus someone who's eating a standard diet and their cholesterol's 5, who's got the higher risk of having a heart attack? Well, certainly the person who's eating the standard diet, you see. And so it's just a marker, and it comes from population studies, again bringing it back to the research, where if we look at the entire population and we say all things being equal, everyone's pretty much in the States is eating the standard US diet. We know that. And so if we take those people and we say, hey, those ones that have high cholesterol from this population that we already know is eating a really unhealthy diet, those ones are more likely to have a heart attack. Doesn't necessarily mean that people who eating a healthy diet, whole food plant-based, for example, and still manage to have a high cholesterol are going to have the same risk. And I know that sounds a little bit like I'm cherry picking or sort of picking and choosing things, but there is a really interesting paper as well about triglycerides. And in that situation, because I had a patient who was doing really well with his diabetes, basically losing a whole lot of weight and things, but his triglycerides went up. And I tried to explain it to him by, oftentimes if you're losing a lot of weight, see that's something that to me will put your cholesterol up, because how does your body use, we know when we're losing weight, we're mobilizing fat stores, right? And so that means that the body's releasing, basically cholesterol and triglycerides and these kinds of things are the remnants of fat molecules in the blood. And so it could be from your diet, or it could be metabolically from your body breaking stuff down and losing weight and things. So if you're losing weight, then your cholesterol will go up for some people. So if you've got it gets complicated, and what we have to remember is the numbers that we have are very rough tools. Whereas going to go off the triglyceride thing is that, he had high triglycerides and his GP got really worried about it, and then sort of I think more or less managed to talk them out of the diet. But when I was, looking into that more for him, I did come across a paper that was saying, hey, look, this is something that we see typically when people have a higher proportion of their diet coming from carbohydrate. That's something you see with a more plant-based diet. And so, these authors were arguing, well, actually, in this population of people, it doesn't seem to matter. It's not indicating the same thing as it would be in your standard diet. And that's the same thing if you've spoken to Dr. Esselstyn, you might have asked him about HDL cholesterol. And we know that with a plant-based diet, or with a low-fat plant-based diet especially, the HDL decreases. And that's, HDL is seen as protective. But if we look at populations around the world who don't have coronary artery disease that Dr. Esselstyn probably talked about, the Papua New Guinea Highlanders, the Tarahumara or Raramuri people, and the Chamane, they don't have high levels of HDL. They have low levels of HDL. And so, when we look at our population that has high rates of cardiovascular disease, and if all things are equal, again, like I was saying before, if we have everyone eating that same standard diet, the people who have higher HDL amongst that population, sure, okay, maybe they're a little bit protected, but it doesn't necessarily mean that having a high HDL is protective. And same with, so all of these numbers are, I guess, imperfect. They're very blunt instruments, and I'm learning that more and more as I'm being, more experienced in medicine and learning more about this. And just it's interesting because we also see, for example, if we lower someone's cholesterol down with a statin, it's not the same. That I wouldn't argue for a second that I could lower someone's cholesterol quite easily, further than probably what Dr. Esselstyn could get doing his diet. Now, if I had to put money on which of those two people was going to have a heart attack, the person who's lowered it with a medication versus and is still eating the standard New Zealand diet or the standard American diet or the standard Australian diet versus Dr. Esselstyn's patient who has a slightly higher cholesterol or even a significantly higher cholesterol, isn't taking the medication, is eating a very healthy, whole food, plant-based, low-fat, no oil diet, then it makes perfect sense to me that we would expect Dr. Esselstyn's patients, and he's demonstrated this time and time again with hundreds of patients, that they have the lowest rate of, having another heart attack of any group that's ever been studied, as far as I can tell. So, it's more complicated and nuanced than people think.
I think the way he simplified during my interview with him was, I guess, they're not eating the way that damages their endothelial cells.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's like that lining there. So if you're eating the animal products, oils, things like that. So even if your cholesterol is high, because you're not eating damage that way, that's his simplified version of how it protects it for someone who doesn't know medicine like me.
Exactly. And usually, like, the cholesterol is a good indicator, usually, of how many of those things you're eating and how much of those things you're eating. So if we look at the general population, so the cholesterol number just happens to be, adjusted really well by the amount of, high fat or high sort of saturated fat, particularly animal products that people are eating. So what's the problem? Is it the cholesterol, or is it that the cholesterol is an indicator of the amount of animal products and everything else that people are eating? So I'm not saying that it's fine to be plant-based or vegan, as you've talked about, eating a whole lot of, potato chips and all of the, Ben and Jerry's and all that kind of thing that's plant-based, having a high cholesterol, and then thinking, oh, well, I'm protected, or even, like the Impossible Burger or whatever now, which, has less saturated fat or all that kind of thing. I'm not saying if you're doing that and you've got a high cholesterol, then you're protected. And I think there's been research now that shows that, unfortunately, even an unhealthy plant-based diet may actually be worse for cardiovascular outcomes in some ways than an omnivorous diet. But yeah, like what I am saying is if you're following the kinds of things that Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Clapper, Dr. Greger, and obviously myself and the research that we did here, if you're following those kind of principles, then I wouldn't get too worried about what your cholesterol's doing,
Definitely. Then I guess one final question for, I guess, the society level. So is there anything that's missing? Like, is there enough research out there, or are there more specific research studies that need to be conducted to show whether whole foods plant-based is the best option, or is the research there? We just need more awareness of it.
Yeah, there's not enough research. That's one of the reasons that you're talking to me, and that anyone even knows, what the broad study is because, and it's got really good, all of those metrics, with being shared and everything, and that's awesome. And thanks everyone who's read it or posted about it or anything. So I really appreciate it. But I'm still, it was we published it in 2017, but the actual work was done on 2014. And I was just thinking to myself before I was doing this interview with you, this is like the gift that keeps giving. It's like 6-7 years since we did this, and I'm still getting asked about it. And this is nice for me, but what I would have loved even better is if all of a sudden we had so much research on whole food plant-based that we were sort of like yesterday's news, and nobody was interested in talking to us about it anymore. So the reality is if you go on to PubMed and you go and put in whole food plant-based, you'll get some studies, but not like if you put in ketogenic diet, for example, then you'll get, say, 2,000 that have been published over the last couple of years, which concerns me. And this just shows like how, unfortunately, research and science don't necessarily follow. We always think that we're making forward progress with things, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. It sort of trends just like anything else does. And you look at whole food plant-based and we might have, I don't know, 100, maybe 200 or something like that over the last couple of years. And a lot of that's just people combining the studies that have already been done. So there definitely does need to be more research. But at the same time, as far as patients are concerned, as far as people who might be watching this who have health concerns, don't wait for the research, and this is one of the things that if you talk to like the likes of, it's like, hey, Dr. Clapper, where's all your research? Like these physicians that I really look up to and respect and I stand on the shoulders of more than, Dr. McDougall, where's all his research? It's like one of the reasons that they don't do the research is they realize that there's no, and they have a real issue with doing the research because even for us, we had a group of patients who didn't get to do what we knew was going to be life-saving, life-changing for them. And potentially we were risking their lives in that sort of 6-month follow-up period before they got to do the next study. So for the likes of, and Dr. McDougall has done some research about Dr. McDougall, Dr. Clapper, the physicians who are actually, Dr. Esselstyn, and who has also done some research too. But once you realize how powerful this is and what a huge difference it can make for people, it becomes very difficult to say, hey, I'm going to put aside time to just, rather than be telling people, and helping people with this, I'm going to pretend like we're not sure and we're going to randomize people to a group where they're not going to get to do what we know is life-saving. I know for Dr. Esselstyn, this is a particular concern of his, and I don't blame him at all. And I completely agree. But unfortunately, we do have this situation where the powers that be in medicine, you think that the colleagues that I spoke to, and me and Nick spoke to about in the journal clubs and things, they were harsh critics. Well, imagine what it's like trying to get, the American Heart Association or even the one here to accept that, the way that Dr. Esselstyn promotes of eating is going to be the thing that's going to reverse and prevent heart disease. Well, that's a whole different story. And that's consistently what I hear is all these excuses. Oh, Dr. Esselstyn's research wasn't randomized. So it doesn't matter. Like it's still, they basically form their own control group and things. And a lot of it's from just not understanding the implications of research and how research should be interpreted. Or yes, look at Dr. Ornish's and they'll say, oh yes, but Dr. Ornish, he also gave them some meditation to do and some yoga. And it's like, look, why don't you guys run the study for us? In the meantime, we'll keep on doing what we do and helping people. But I think if there's anyone watching this and interested in doing research, then I would certainly encourage it. And you really have a real opportunity to, if you're interested in doing research and making a big name for yourself, then it's a no-brainer really, because you can get some amazing results that you're not going to get with anything else, and really change the world and get some of these guidelines changed and things like that. We shouldn't have to do that. And I think it's just a natural progression in time. It will happen. Someone will do it. There's probably people working on stuff already. I know Ornish is working on cognitive decline or Alzheimer's at the moment. That's the thing about Ornish, is he doesn't stick with one thing. He moves on to more and more different things that he can show, like the prostate cancer and so forth, studies that he's done. So it's I think in time we'll get there. Do we need more research? Yes, but everyone knows that we need more research. So if you're a clinician like myself, do you need more research to get started? No. If you're a researcher, this is a really great thing for you to be researching, and this is a really big way that you can make a big difference to things.
Amazing. And I think just my main takeaways from speaking to you today is, like, there's the universities that provide funding so far, so that's great. If there's philanthropic organizations that listen to this would be a great place to put money into for research.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the studies out there, I guess you said, like prescription drugs, there's like 5 studies, and they choose the one that supports their claim.
Yeah.
So, and it revolves around the money.
They can hide. Yeah. I think they've started making some changes to how things are doing, but certainly that used to be a practice. And there's all sorts of ways. People think that science happens in a vacuum, where there's no bias and there's no kind of, even what you're choosing to research, even the way that you're framing that is biased. And so if you have a company, and you see this especially, and this is the problem with nutrition research, right, is then of course you've got other industries that are interested in funding that, and it'll be the egg industry or the dairy industry, or the beef and lamb is one in New Zealand, but there'll be the equivalent in the States. And so those industries will fund research. And so of course then they start looking for, before they even, it's not blue skies. They don't just think, oh, we'll just research to see. They're like, no, what is something that we could show? Well, we have an example in New Zealand, which is actually quite funny, which is the kiwi fruit industry. And they've funded research, and Dr. Greger's got a couple on his website. I think one of them, which would be quite popular at the moment, is kiwi fruit for upper respiratory tract infections or something like that. So, and it was better than bananas or something. But the funny thing is which kiwi fruit did they use? Well, there's a couple. There's your standard green kiwi fruit, which you'll be familiar with. But then they also had developed this, the gold kiwi fruit. And the gold kiwi fruit is like patented, basically. So only New Zealand, which is Zespri, can make the gold kiwi fruit. And so, of course, when they did the study against the banana, they didn't use the standard green one, which anyone in the world can grow. They used their special, the gold kiwi fruit, so that they could show, the gold kiwi fruit, which is probably just as good or something. But of course, they didn't run it against the green one. So you've got that same issue whenever you've got like a financial imperative for what you're finding. And so that's why it's so important that government organizations and universities, particularly, even then there's still bias in the funding, but so that the studies aren't designed to find a certain outcome and in the first place, and sort of funneled down that.
That's the biggest thing I love about your study and all the studies out there, where it's like, there's my bias. If I do a study, I want to prove that whole foods, plant-based is the best. So having, like, I guess, the scientific method where it's like control groups, things like that makes it really good. So
randomize it.
Exactly. Is there any final words you have for anyone, or any websites people could visit to learn more about what you do, or any resources?
Well, my personal website is twozestybananas.com. That's an easy one to remember. I need to do more work on it. And it's, I'm doing a lot of work in general practice, and also, but more importantly, I'm a board director for Australasian health promotion charity called Doctors for Nutrition, and doctorsfornutrition.org is their website. And I'd really recommend them. Give them a follow on social media. I should say us. I'm part of the organisation. And basically our goal is to be, I suppose, for anyone who knows of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine in the United States, we're kind of a similar organisation in New Zealand and Australia. And so we're aiming to educate health practitioners about the power of a whole food plant-based eating pattern, and we talk a lot about the evidence and things on our social media and research that's coming out. We are hoping, of course, to do some research in the future, so if anyone's watching us who's got a lot of money, send it our way and we'll do some research for you. And also just be an organisation that brings together, and you'll see on our website we've got about 20 people on our advisory council from across New Zealand and Australia, who are all other doctors or dietitians who have an interest in whole food plant-based nutrition. So that would be my recommendation over my own website, though my own website at some stage in the future I'll definitely update and things. And then my only other suggestion from all of this and the kind of vibe that I'd like to give for people is that you can there was nothing special about us doing this study. We just did it, and at times that meant we wouldn't necessarily know what we'd be doing the session on the night that we were doing it. I'd be busy working on it. A couple of hours beforehand, we'd be trying to work out what food for people to cook. It's always messy. It ends up looking nice and planned out and stuff like that. And when you've got a paper written up, but yeah, it's something that I really believe that anyone can do. And if we can manage to do it in Gisborne with the kind of experience, and no university support at that point, just wanting to do something, then do please take away from this that you can make a difference and you can do something that will be really helpful for plant-based and for the movement generally, and just the environment and everything that we're striving to improve at the moment.